I know. You were expecting a reaction, but seeing how this album made me cry, I need to talk about it. It's Shawn C with the missing Nike tee, and we're here today to talk about how I feel on this new Saba Care For Me album. Saba's music is always an artist's music that I kind of dread going into. After my experience with the Comfort Zone, I believe it was called, back in 2016, when you guys recommended it heavy to me, I listened to it, tried to get through it, couldn't listen to the rest on my own time, but just was not impressed. And it sucks because I know so many of you guys had good intentions. A lot of you wanted me to enjoy that album, but I had kind of a similar experience with the Bucket List. I felt like Saba's way of explaining himself was not as interesting or as eccentric as someone like maybe a No Name who had a very distinct sound of her own, or maybe like a Mick Jenkins. So that being the case, when people told me about this new album, I was interested, but I still had those same fears in the back of my mind. Is he going to interest me? Is he going to entertain me for the duration of this project? It being only 10 tracks, I felt like he really couldn't go wrong. So I listened to it really without much worry because I didn't feel like I had that much to lose as far as time is concerned. I mean, it was only like 42 minutes, 10 tracks. What do I gotta lose? Chicago has a certain sound when it comes to their rappers. You know, you got like a Joey Purp, a Mick Jenkins, Chance the Rapper, No Name. You got other artists who've kind of dipped and dabbled in the hip house sound before, like Gold Link and Smino. So for me, when you make that kind of musical choice, that's the style that you decide to go with, it's kind of hard to stand out because the production is so minimal, the production is so simple, it's very laid back, very low key. So you pretty much need to offset the instrumental with a very eccentric, very entertaining flow or rapping capability. And I can say, for a good portion of this album, Saba does just that. I honestly was not expecting this project, it being from Saba, to have such a strong concept, such a strong theme to it. The theme of this album pretty much revolving around the relationship that Saba has with, or Saba had with, his cousin, and pretty much limiting a lot of his depression down to his survivor's guilt. He feels guilty for not calling, he feels guilty for not being around as often, he feels guilty for leaving certain relationships, and in general he just feels like he doesn't deserve what he has right now. In the very first track, Busy slash Sirens, I believe it is, Saba seems to be recalling all the mistakes he's made in regards to his relationship. Although I think the second half sounds a bit like Chance, I think the fact that it goes into the subject matter of a 15-year-old getting killed just because he fits the description is just awful to me. Awful in a good way for the track, but awful in my thought, because who wants to think of a 15-year-old kid dying just because he fits the description? And Saba makes some pretty strong references to Chicago lifestyle in this album as well. In this track, he kind of hints at the Tamir Rice situation. Broken Girls is a track I really don't find myself enjoying at all because he kind of sounds like a crooning version of Mick Jenkins. I do have to give him credit for his versatility though, and his skill set when it comes to being able to switch up his flows and his cadence and his voice pattern, because when he switches to the hook, when he starts singing, it sounds like two completely different artists. And that's kind of one of the highlights for this project, because keep in mind, at this point I'm still enjoying it because I feel like I'm getting a lot of Chicago artists in it. Saba came up around the same time that Chance and Vic Mensa and Mick Jenkins and all those other guys came up at. So it's kind of hard for me to expect him or think that he wouldn't take from that style too. I mean, it's kind of a theme with Chicago. I mean, they all kind of sound similar in their own ways from time to time. So when I hear other artists from Chicago show up in each other's music, I tend to enjoy it more. Life starts out with like one of the best lines in any track. I know Pac was 25. I know Jesus was 33. I tell death to keep a distance. I think he obsessed with me. And I can definitely tell on this track the conviction within Saba's voice as he's detailing his less than optimistic view on life based off his upbringing. Only thing that holds this track back for me is how the verse kind of transitions into the hook very, very well, but the hook is just not catchy or strong or melodic. It kind of drags on a bit. I actually think during the first hook, when he goes to the end and says, "Life don't mean shit to a dude," that could have been easily a more impactful hook. I initially thought the track Calligraphy was horribly written until I listened to it about 6 times, because the more and more I kept listening to it, the more and more I realized what the definition of calligraphy and hieroglyph was. So I felt like there were a lot of innuendos and a lot of underlying messages to a lot of what this track was saying, especially on the one line where Saba says, "My best friend's obituary hanging on my wall." Emphasis on my wall. and then he says right next to the dresser, because at a later point in this album he heavily mentions the wall being the place where these people write, then says he's building a wall in his own head. So it kind of hints at Saba putting this obituary from his friend, you know, his cousin, in his own head, even though it's also on his wall in his dresser. He's got a wall in his head that he's putting this obituary on. He's got a wall on his dresser that he put the obituary on. So he's kind of trying to imply that he's trying to see things from his friend's perspective. He's trying to live through the lens of his friend. It's kind of like he's using calligraphy to describe time in a way, like a metaphor for time. As he says, only timing will tell when you find all your letters. As we get into the track Fighter, is kind of when I'm getting some Kendrick Lamar vibes, like some Good Kid, Mad City. In regards to the flow, I feel like a little bit of the art of peer pressure. I feel a similar way on the last 45 seconds of Gray. It kind of gives me a Free Off to Pimp a Butterfly feeling. Super jazzy while he goes off lyrically, but not really that many stops in his flow. It's just kind of a continuous onslaught. Still very enjoyable sonically, and at this point in the album, I'm waiting to see what's next. Then we get two of the strongest tracks on this entire project. On the track Prom King, Saba very interestingly and charismatically, if that's a word, tells the story of how he began a friendship with his cousin. And I like the way he kind of describes this, because a lot of people think that you have to be friends with your family members, that you have to be close with them. It essentially paints his cousin as just a regular guy that he didn't even have to probably be related to begin a friendship with. Walter and Saba essentially going back and forth over what they're gonna do for prom, and Saba lying and saying that he has a date even though he's not sure of it. And he kind of, you know, opens himself up and says he was scared and sent this whole page essay to this one girl that he never got a reply to, and she broke his heart. So his cousin Walter ends up setting him up with a date. I love how Saba tackles or taps into his emotions and like the feelings he describes as he's talking about his excitement but trying to hide it as he's getting ready for this prom date. The lyrics of this track are so detailed and admirable. He speaks on their relationship so long that he ends up talking about how they formed the rap group Pivot, and essentially how he changed his lifestyle. I mean, his mom was asking him where he was going out more, getting home late, essentially chopping that up to his relationship with Walter. Saba then speaks ahead to when he's working on his project Bucket List. This track instantly becomes heartbreaking, not only because Saba is very passionately and very angrily showing the emotion and the worry in his voice as he's talking about his cousin, and his cousin calling him and saying he just almost was murdered, but vividly and accurately, in my opinion, painting a picture of Chicago lifestyle. And Saba does not, you know, shift gears on this track. I mean, it's in constant drive, it's in constant motion. He gets so detailed in this song that he chops up expecting the news to cover the potential situation that would have happened with Walter as just another rival street gang incident. As we get to the closing portion of this track, and Saba spent so much time humanizing not only the relationship that he's built with his cousin, but Walter himself, telling you how excited Walter was about recording the music and finally getting back together with Saba. When he implies his death by adding to the song Just Another Day in the Ghetto, you just feel awful, because you already know what happened to Walter at that point when they're like, oh, wherever you are, we're gonna find you. Your mom calls us, she can't find you. When the closing portion to this more somber ending happens, it's almost as if you can see Saba running towards his cousin and end up seeing a lifeless body laid out in the middle of the street. And then we get the final track. And this is the track that had me cry, because I don't think I ever listened to music in that way before, where I was trying to envision myself from my friend's perspective, you know, eliminating Saba and what he was talking about. I was thinking about my friend and how he felt, and I easily could have put him in the same position. It was as if my body was reacting to the sadness of the track, but my mind was somewhere completely different. I didn't feel sad when I was hearing it, but I couldn't stop myself from having that immediate trigger, because I thought about it in the exact same way. I didn't know what some of my friends who passed away in that way would have felt. And as Saba, you know, and as we transition into this final track, we hear Saba detail and talk about his friend coming to grips with the fact that he just died. On the final track, Saba is now fully speaking from the perspective of Walt, who we know is passed on, because the intro starts off with, yelling at my mama, I know you can hear me. It's awful because Walt at that point in the track doesn't know he's dead. He only comes to grips with this understanding after he starts describing his own crime scene. Chalk line looked like the shape of my shadow, yelling at his brothers, but you know, also the same thing happens. They don't hear him. He feels like he can walk through walls, and the track brings the album to a very somber but appropriate ending. And there are also other tracks on here where Saba goes into extreme detail about his life, like on the track Fighters, where he talks about him falling out with his grandfather, basically, because his grandfather sees that he's following the same path that his father did. Saba's father dabbled, I think dipped and dabbled in R&B and kind of like the music field and kind of did what Saba wanted to do, and I guess his grandfather kind of came to the understanding that Saba was a little bit more academically inclined because he graduated early, so I'm assuming he thought he would use this time to progress himself, but he did it to make music instead. Kind of details how he and his grandfather fell out. On the track Fighters, he essentially talks about his conflicts with other human beings. The track Smile, I'm not really that fond of, and Logout really doesn't do that much for me either, even though it describes kind of the social media atmosphere and how Saba is describing the pressure of having a label and having a hit, how those labels don't really put I guess emphasis on songs that have high quality, especially for the kind of music that Saba is trying to introduce. The main highlight about this track for me is the fact that Saba explores so many different flows so effortlessly, but I don't really think the Chance the Rapper feature was needed as it shows up in the last 40 seconds of the track. And although I do kind of enjoy the concept of this project, I do feel like at some points it's a little bit scattered and it doesn't really follow a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 formula. It kind of follows a 7, 3, 8, 12 kind of thing. It doesn't really go together as far as a start to end story. It kind of just happens randomly all over the place. One track will get, you know, Saba talking about his relationship. Another track will get a random feeling from Saba of depression, which, like I said, makes the album a nice experience. But I guess essentially what I mean is these tracks don't really lead into one another that well, with the exception of the final two. I think it would have been a great thing on Saba's part if he would have started out this album from Walt's perspective, sending a thought to Saba in the beginning, and then we get from Saba's perspective. By the time the album ends, we see what happens to Walt. I mean, that's just my own thing. It doesn't have to be there. It could just make the album a little bit more cohesive to me. But as far as I'm concerned, this is a very good album as it comes to dealing with depression, survivor's guilt. Very introspective, pretty humbling, and it's a very nice tribute to his cousin who also became his best friend. Very enjoyable project to me. I like exactly where Saba was going with this one. I personally enjoy this one the most, not only because I can strongly relate to it, but I just think he does such a great job of keeping himself very eccentric and entertaining on these tracks, even if there's something he's talking about that I could really care less for, like on the track Logout. But Saba, you did a great job with this project. I really enjoyed this one. Saba, care for me. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed the video, go ahead and leave a thumbs up. I will see you in the next one. Like I said, if you haven't listened to this project, you need to. I'm hereby recommending Saba at this point. It's been me. It's been real. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. I'm out. Peace.